They say children don't understand the consequences of their actions, that they are innocent in their mischief. But when I woke up to find a permanent marker scrawled all across my face, a cruel smile frozen in ink, I realized that some wounds run deeper than skin. I was 76 years old, a grandmother who had spent countless hours caring for her family, who had willingly come to stay in her grandson's house to help with his children after a painful hip surgery left me less mobile than before. Yet in that moment, the lines drawn on my cheeks were not just childish pranks. They were a message, a mark of disrespect so blatant and personal that it shattered every illusion I had held about love and family. I live now in a small, quiet apartment on the edge of town, far from the chaos of that house. But it took time and many silent nights before I found the courage to leave, to reclaim the dignity that had been quietly eroded beneath laughter and dismissive words. For years I had been the one everyone turned to, the caretaker, the listener, the warm presence who baked cookies and patched scraped knees, who whispered lullabies in the dark and sat patiently through school recitals no one else attended. I was the anchor, the keeper of traditions, the one who always made space, always gave more than she received. But when the marker traced its harsh lines across my face while I slept, I understood that I had become invisible, a burden to the family I loved, a ghost they tolerated rather than embraced. This story is not just about that night or the cruel act itself. It is about the slow unraveling of respect, the quiet betrayals that come in small doses until one day the pain cannot be ignored. It is about the subtle ways love can turn to neglect and how resilience grows not from grand gestures, but from the simple, determined act of standing up and walking away. When I first arrived at Jordan's house, my heart was full of hope and tenderness. He was my only grandson, the son of my eldest daughter who had passed away many years ago, leaving me to fill the gaps in ways that sometimes felt overwhelming, but always worthwhile. The house was lively, filled with the noise of children and the smell of cooking, a place that promised family and belonging. I arrived carrying a suitcase filled with my own clothes and the little things I needed for a short stay, along with a basket of homemade biscuits and preserves I had spent hours preparing. I had imagined mornings spent helping with breakfast, afternoons reading stories and playing quietly in the backyard, evenings surrounded by laughter and warmth. But from the moment I stepped through the door, the atmosphere felt off. There was a tension beneath the surface, a brittle politeness that never quite reached the eyes. I was shown to a small room that once had been the laundry, converted quickly and cheaply to house me for the months I needed to recover. The bed was narrow, the paint peeling from the walls, and the window overlooked the cluttered backyard where the children played, oblivious to the growing distance between us. At first I told myself this was just adjustment, that family dynamics could be complicated, that perhaps my presence was simply something they were still getting used to. I reminded myself that after a lifetime of giving, I could be patient a little longer. But the marker incident changed everything. I had fallen asleep in the living room after a long day of helping with the kids, my body aching, but my spirit willing. When I woke, the rough lines of blue and black ink tracing across my forehead, cheeks, and chin startled me, not just because of their vividness, but because of the way they shattered the sanctuary I had believed I'd found. I looked around for someone to comfort me, to say it was just a joke and they were sorry, but no one was near. Later, I overheard Jordan's voice through the vent, his words cold and dismissive, laughing as if this humiliation was no more than a prank, a momentary amusement at my expense. The words stung worse than the ink. She's lucky we don't charge her rent. That phrase echoed in my mind not because of money, but because it revealed the truth I had refused to see. I was no longer family, but a guest tolerated under duress, an obligation they wished would end. It was the first crack in the foundation of my world. The moment when I realized the care I gave was taken for granted, and that love had been replaced by convenience. Each day after, the small slights accumulated. The cold meals left in the back of the fridge, the offhand remarks about water usage, the way the children avoided my gaze, and my room became a place of silence rather than refuge. I began to retreat within myself, shrinking away from the spaces I once occupied freely, feeling the weight of invisibility pressing down until it almost crushed me. But somewhere beneath the hurt, a quiet flame kindled, a stubborn refusal to disappear without a fight. Finding that old pillow in the linen closet, the one I had embroidered years before when Jordan was born, I traced my fingers over the stitches and felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. I took the laundry marker and wrote the word loser in bold letters across its surface, not out of spite, but as a statement, a claim of my right to be seen and heard, to refuse the erasure that had been imposed on me. The next morning, when the pillow was discovered, the house erupted in chaos. Jordan's fury was fierce, his words sharp and accusatory. But for the first time, I stood my ground, letting him hear the truth of the pain he had caused, the insult he had inflicted not just on my face, but on my very being. When I packed my bags and left, I did not do so with anger or bitterness, but with a calm resolve born of years of endurance and the sudden clarity that freedom is sometimes found in walking away. I moved into a small apartment of my own, surrounded by quiet and light, and there I began to rebuild, not for them, but for myself. The pillow hangs by my door, a reminder of what was lost and what was gained, the power to define myself on my own terms. And though the road ahead is still uncertain, I know that in reclaiming my dignity, I have found a strength that no marker can erase. The day everything changed wasn't marked by one single explosion of anger or betrayal, but by a series of quiet moments that, taken together, formed a crescendo of pain I couldn't ignore. I remember waking up early that morning, the faint gray light of dawn filtering through the curtains of the laundry room that had become my bedroom, the cold wooden floor creaking beneath my feet as I shuffled to the small bathroom down the hall. My hip was stiff from the night's sleep, but I had learned to push through discomfort. The house was still and hushed, with only the soft ticking of the kitchen clock and the distant hum of a television somewhere in the living room breaking the silence. I dressed slowly, pulling on a sweater that smelled faintly of mothballs and a pair of slippers I had brought from home, feeling the unfamiliar weight of being a guest in a place that didn't quite feel like home. When I stepped into the kitchen, I noticed immediately the absence of warmth. The usual bustle of children's voices was gone, replaced by a strained quiet, as if everyone was tiptoeing around some invisible line I was not meant to cross. Jordan was already there, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone with that distracted, half-listening expression I had come to recognize as a shield. His wife, Emily, was bustling about with a furrowed brow, her movements brisk and sharp as she prepared breakfast for their 2 children. Their eyes barely met mine, and when they did, it was with a polite but distant nod, a gesture that felt like a formality rather than a greeting. I sat down at the kitchen table, the worn surface scarred with years of use and forgotten moments, and tried to steady my breathing. The marker incident from the night before was still fresh on my mind, the vivid blue lines tracing across my cheekbones like a cruel caricature. I had tried to wash it off in the dark, but the ink was stubborn, staining my skin like a brand. I dared not mention it, not yet, hoping somehow it would pass, that someone would acknowledge the humiliation and offer a word of kindness. But kindness was scarce in that house, replaced instead by whispered jokes and sideways glances that made my skin crawl. Later, I heard Jordan's voice through the vent again, low and laced with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "She's lucky we don't charge her rent," he said, and the words hit me harder than any slap. It wasn't just about money. It was the unmistakable message that I was no longer family, no longer a valued presence, but an obligation, an inconvenience to be endured until I could be quietly dismissed. The children, oblivious to the adult tension swirling around them, kept their distance. They barely spoke to me, their eyes flicking away whenever I tried to catch their gaze. The little boy, Michael, who once sat on my lap and begged for stories of faraway lands, now barely acknowledged my existence. His sister, Lily, whispered to her friends on her tablet, her laughter echoing down the hall but never reaching me. The house felt colder, emptier, as if my very presence was draining the life from its walls. I tried to keep busy, helping with laundry, tidying the kitchen, preparing meals, but every small kindness seemed to go unnoticed or was met with a curt, "Thanks, Grandma," that felt like a command rather than gratitude. The emotional distance was suffocating, but I told myself I was here for the children, that this was temporary, a sacrifice I was willing to make. Yet deep inside, a quiet storm was brewing. The moment of clarity came that afternoon, when Jordan's laughter rang out down the hall, sharp and cruel, as I heard him recount the story of the marker to a group of friends on the phone. "You should have seen her face," he chuckled. "She didn't even know what hit her. Classic grandma move, right? Can't even stay mad when she's covered in permanent ink." The words were like knives, slicing through the remnants of my dignity. I felt the walls closing in, the realization that I was the subject of mockery, a living joke to those I had once loved fiercely. I retreated to my room, the cramped space feeling smaller than ever, the walls closing in as tears blurred my vision. But it wasn't just the marker, it was the betrayal, the quiet erasure of everything I had given, everything I had been. That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the house, the muffled laughter, the soft footsteps, the occasional slam of a door, and felt the unbearable weight of loneliness. The person who had once been the heart of this family was now a ghost, drifting unnoticed and unmissed. And in that darkness, a resolve began to form, a flicker of strength I thought I had lost long ago. I would no longer be the silent victim of their disregard. I would find a way to reclaim my voice, my space, myself. The catalyst was not the marker itself, but the realization that I was no longer welcome, that my love and labor had been repaid with cruelty and neglect. It was the moment I understood that survival meant more than endurance. It meant action. And so, in the days that followed, I began to gather the fragments of my fractured dignity, preparing to take the first steps away from the place that had become a prison disguised as a home. This story is not just about the cruel joke or the words left unsaid. It is about the awakening of a woman who had spent too long in the shadows and was finally ready to step into the light, no matter how blinding it might be. After that unbearable day when the marker incident turned from a childish prank into a glaring sign of my diminishing place in Jordan's household, the subtle but steady erosion of my presence began to accelerate in ways I hadn't anticipated, but somehow had feared. Each morning, I woke to a different form of exclusion. Each evening, I lay down feeling smaller, more invisible, like a shadow retreating from the light. The house no longer welcomed me as it once had, if it ever truly had. I was no longer the grandmother who was included, whose opinions mattered, whose existence was acknowledged with warmth. Instead, I became a background figure, present yet ignored, alive yet unseen. The small room that had been hastily converted into my bedroom became my entire world, a place where I spent most of my waking hours alone, avoiding the kitchen and living room where the family gathered without me, or so it seemed. They spoke softly, careful not to wake me if I happened to nap during the day. But the kindness was hollow, a formality rather than affection. My food was labeled Grandma's in a cramped handwriting on masking tape, then pushed to the back of the fridge as if it were an afterthought, something to be hidden away rather than cherished. The water I was allowed to use was carefully rationed, with Jordan remarking offhandedly about how expensive my long baths were, though I barely took any. I found myself tiptoeing around the house, not to disturb, but because I was beginning to feel like a burden, a presence to be minimized and managed rather than embraced. The children, once my joy and comfort, treated me as a stranger. Michael barely spoke to me except when told to do so, and Lily's eyes darted away whenever I tried to connect. Their rooms were off limits, and invitations to join their games or outings were conspicuously absent. When I offered to help with homework or cooking, my suggestions were brushed aside as unnecessary. I started to spend more time in my room, reading old novels and tracing my fingers over the stitches of a quilt I had made years ago, the one tangible piece of my love that seemed to endure where I did not. The silence was sometimes broken by laughter from the other rooms, laughter that felt cruel in its casualness, laughter that reminded me of the distance growing between us. I was the invisible guest, the forgotten caretaker. One evening, as I was washing dishes in the tiny sink of the shared kitchen, I overheard Emily on the phone, her voice low and conspiratorial, saying, "She's not a problem, just, well, she's here, but it's like she isn't." That phrase, "like she isn't," echoed inside me, a dagger hidden in everyday words. It was the sound of exclusion, the verbal seal on my fading role in their lives. No one said it to my face, of course. The cruelty was in the omission, in the way my presence was acknowledged only when convenient, in the way my help was taken for granted but never thanked. The small kindnesses I had hoped for, the invitation to sit at the table, the shared cup of tea, a smile that reached the eyes, were replaced by polite nods and quick departures. I began to question my own worth, wondering if the years of sacrifice and love had been invisible all along. The walls seemed to close in, the weight of loneliness pressing down with a quiet insistence. I had come to help, to be needed, but instead I found myself pushed to the edges, diminished and dismissed. Yet even in this slow suffocation, a seed of resistance was planted. I realized that survival meant more than enduring. It meant finding ways to reclaim even the smallest spaces of dignity. So I began to hold on to little acts of defiance, keeping the cup I liked rather than the one handed to me, folding my clothes just so, preserving my quiet rituals that reminded me who I was beyond the roles they assigned me. I found solace in the quiet mornings, when the house was still, in the evenings spent tracing patterns in the worn carpet, in the letters I wrote to myself that I never sent. The growing isolation forced me to confront a painful truth. Love can be conditional, family can be fragile, and the ties that bind can also suffocate. But it also sparked a fragile hope that I could choose a different path, one where I was not merely tolerated, but truly seen. It was a slow awakening, a gathering of strength in the silence. The first escalation was not marked by one dramatic event, but by a series of small, cumulative exclusions that made it clear I was no longer part of the life I had helped build. It was a quiet unraveling that left me questioning what it meant to belong and what it meant to be free. The day I found that old pillow tucked away in the linen closet felt like a turning point, a quiet awakening amid the storm of neglect and invisibility that had become my daily reality. It was a simple object, faded and worn, but it carried the weight of years I had poured into my family, the countless nights I had stayed up sewing and stitching, the love woven into every thread when I embroidered that pillow for Jordan's birth. Symbol of hope and protection I never thought I'd need to reclaim in this way. Holding it in my hands, tracing the delicate patterns with my fingers, I felt something shift inside me, a flicker of power stirring in the depths of my quiet despair. I realized that if I was going to survive this slow erasure, I would have to mark my presence in a way they could not ignore, not with anger or violence, but with something that said, simply and clearly, I am here. I am real. I matter. So I took the laundry marker, harsh, permanent, and carefully wrote the word loser across the pillow, the letters neat and deliberate, not chaotic or wild, but calm and precise, like a statement carved into stone. It was not a childish retaliation or a fit of bitterness. It was an act of clarity, a reclaiming of my voice in a place where I had been silenced. When I placed the pillow back on the shelf, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. I knew this small defiance could not go unnoticed, that the household's fragile equilibrium would shatter when the pillow was found. But for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to strength. The next morning, the quiet house erupted in chaos as the pillow was discovered. Jordan's anger was fierce, sharp as a blade, his words lashing out in a storm of accusations and disbelief. "How dare you vandalize our things?" he shouted, his face flushed with rage. But I did not flinch. I met his fury with a steady calm that surprised even me. I spoke slowly, deliberately, laying bare the pain behind the ink on my face and the letters on the pillow. "You drew on my face while I slept," I said quietly, "and I wrote on a pillow. Which of us forgot that I am a person, not a joke or a burden?" His mouth opened, then closed. Words caught in the tension between us. For the first time, the wall of dismissal between us cracked, revealing the raw wounds beneath. It was not reconciliation, but it was recognition. In the days that followed, the house was thick with unspoken tension, but I felt a lightness I hadn't known in months. I began to pack, not in anger, but with the quiet certainty that I could no longer live where I was unseen and unheard. I wrote a short note to the children, simple and kind, explaining that I was leaving, that I loved them, and that sometimes love means walking away to find oneself again. When I stepped out the door, suitcase in hand, the weight of years seemed to lift from my shoulders. I moved into a small apartment of my own, a modest space filled with light and silence, where I could begin to rebuild not just a home, but a sense of self that had been lost in the shadows. The pillow, marked with that bold word, hung near my door, not as a symbol of anger, but as a reminder of the moment I chose myself, the moment I reclaimed my dignity. In the quiet that followed, I began to explore new rhythms, volunteering at a local school, rediscovering old friends, finding joy in small acts of kindness and connection. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with both challenges and possibilities, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free. This was not the life I had planned, nor the one I had imagined, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. The past has a way of creeping back in when you least expect it, like shadows lengthening as the sun dips below the horizon, soft but relentless, pressing against the fragile walls you have built to protect yourself. After I left Jordan's house and settled into my small apartment, a space that felt both unfamiliar and strangely liberating, I thought I had finally put the worst behind me. I was wrong. It began with a letter, simple and unexpected, slipped under my door one damp morning. The handwriting was unmistakable. Jordan's eldest son, my grandson Michael. The only one who had ever shown me a flicker of kindness. The one who wrote with a shaky hand, but a sincere heart. His letter was short, but heartfelt. A plea that seemed to come from a place of confusion and longing rather than anger. "Grandma," he wrote, "we miss you. Dad and Mom are worried. I don't know what's happening, but I hope you're okay." For a moment, I sat with the letter in my hands, feeling the fragile threads of connection tug at me, reminding me of the family I had lost and the love that still lingered in small, hidden places. But the letter was also a reminder that the world I had stepped away from was not finished with me. Within days, Jordan and Emily arrived at my doorstep unannounced, their faces tight with a mixture of frustration and something that might have been regret, or maybe just the weight of responsibility. They came with apologies that felt rehearsed and strained, with offers of help I neither needed nor wanted. Jordan's eyes searched mine, looking for forgiveness or understanding. But I was no longer the woman who would simply accept their words and fold back into the roles they assigned me. I listened quietly as they spoke of family, of tradition, of the importance of staying together through hardship. But beneath the surface, I sensed the old dynamics swirling. Control, expectation, the unspoken demand to conform to their version of who I should be. It was Emily who finally broke the silence, her voice trembling slightly as she admitted the marker incident had been a mistake, a stupid joke that went too far. She looked at me pleadingly, as if hoping for absolution. I nodded slowly, not because I forgave, but because I understood. Hurt is often born of fear and ignorance, but understanding did not mean surrender. The confrontation that followed was quiet but fierce, a test of boundaries and wills. Jordan accused me of making a scene, of turning a minor incident into a family crisis, and I met his words with the calm certainty of one who has been invisible too long. "I did not make a scene," I said. "You forgot that a grandmother's love is not a joke. You forgot that respect is earned by kindness, not demanded by fear." The children watched from the hallway, their eyes wide and uncertain, as if witnessing a battle they did not understand, but could not ignore. The days that followed were a whirlwind of phone calls, visits from distant relatives, and a deluge of messages from friends and neighbors who had heard fragments of the story. It seemed that my leaving had become a spectacle, a drama that everyone had an opinion on but few had truly understood. Jordan's family began to portray me as difficult, as a woman who had chosen pride over love, and I realized with a mix of sadness and relief that their version of the truth was no longer my concern. The newspaper article that appeared a week later was the final blow. Titled, "Grandmother's Disappearance Raises Questions," it painted a picture of confusion and worry, quoting Jordan and Emily's carefully crafted statements about concern and family distress. The photo was one from years ago, smiling and holding a pie, a false image of the woman who had been erased. I read the article with a mixture of disbelief and quiet fury. They had taken my absence and turned it into a performance for public consumption, a narrative that stripped me of agency and painted me as a victim rather than a woman reclaiming her life. I showed the article to my neighbor, a woman named Helen, who had lost her own mother to family neglect, and she shook her head slowly. "They think they own you," she said quietly. "But you belong to yourself now." Those words became my mantra. I refused to be the character in their story. I would write my own. The pressure mounted as lawyers arrived, letters piled up with legal jargon demanding my return or threatening to challenge my right to the property I had helped build. I answered with calm, measured replies, asserting my independence and my right to live free from coercion. The emotional weight was heavy, the isolation deepened, but I was no longer alone. I found support in unexpected places: a community center where women my age gathered to share stories, a book club where I was not a relic but a participant, a volunteer program that valued my years of experience. These connections became lifelines, reminders that life could be rebuilt, reshaped, and reimagined beyond the confines of old wounds. Then came Lisa's visit to the cafe where I worked part-time, a visit that carried the tension of unspoken truths and fragile negotiations. She came alone, wearing the polished armor of a woman who had spent years mastering the art of control. Her eyes held a flicker of vulnerability as she tried to bridge the gap between us, but I saw through the veneer. Her words were soft but firm, a plea for peace wrapped in excuses and half-truths. "I wasn't trying to replace you," she said. "I just didn't want your shadow in every room." I met her gaze steadily. "I am not your shadow," I replied. "I am my own person, and I am finally remembering how to be one." That moment, raw and unvarnished, was not a reconciliation, but a reckoning. We parted without promises, without tears, but with a new understanding that some ties, once severed, must remain so for healing to begin. The legal battles, the family dramas, the media attention, they all paled in comparison to the quiet, daily act of reclaiming myself. I wrote letters, not to demand or accuse, but to close chapters and open new doors. I sent small gifts to Michael, gestures of love untainted by expectation. I built friendships grounded in mutual respect rather than obligation. The wounds of the past remained, faint scars that reminded me of the journey, but they no longer defined me. Instead, I defined myself through each choice, each step forward into a life reclaimed and reshaped. This second escalation was not a single moment of confrontation, but a tide of challenges that tested my resolve and clarified my purpose. It was the hard labor of disentangling myself from old roles and scripts, the painful but necessary act of forging a new identity from the ashes of loss. And in that struggle, I found not just survival, but the quiet strength to thrive. The moment I sent that letter was the moment I stepped fully into my own power, a quiet yet irrevocable act that severed the last lingering ties to a family who had long ceased to see me as anything but an inconvenience. I sat at my small kitchen table, the light from the single lamp casting shadows that danced gently on the peeling wallpaper. And with a steady hand, I folded the paper, the words sharp and clear in my mind as I traced them one last time before. Slipping the envelope into the mailbox. It was not an angry letter. It was not a plea or a demand. It was a statement of fact and of intent, a declaration that I was done with being someone's burden, someone's joke, someone's afterthought. I told them I was safe, of sound mind, and living in a place where I was respected and valued. I informed them that I had retained legal counsel, that any further attempts at contact under the guise of concern would be regarded as harassment. It was the final boundary, drawn with the precision and firmness of a woman who had endured too much and refused to endure any longer. For years, I had played the part assigned to me, caretaker, peacemaker, silent sufferer. But the woman who sat in that chair writing those words was no longer willing to be invisible. The act of mailing the letter was more than just a logistical step. It was a symbolic rebirth, a reclaiming of agency that had been denied to me for far too long. The days that followed were marked by an uneasy silence from the family, a vacuum where their voices had once pressed and prodded. They sent lawyers and messages, but I stood firm, buoyed by the support of friends and the quiet certainty that I was finally living on my own terms. The tension came to a head one afternoon when Lisa appeared unexpectedly at the cafe where I worked. Her face was a mixture of exhaustion and something that might have been remorse, though it was hard to tell beneath the practiced mask of control she wore. She asked if we could talk, privately, and I led her to a quiet corner booth. The hum of conversation around us a gentle backdrop to the storm I felt rising within. She spoke of fear and misunderstanding, of how the family had panicked and made mistakes, but beneath her words was the unspoken admission that the roles had been reversed, that the woman they had tried to silence was now the one who held the power to say no. I listened, not with bitterness, but with the calm clarity that comes from knowing your worth. When she said, "I wasn't trying to replace you, just to protect my family," I looked her in the eye and said, "I am not your shadow. I am my own person, and I am finally remembering how to be one." It was not a truce or a promise, but a boundary set with grace and strength. The real climax was not in the confrontation, but in what followed. My refusal to return to the old script. My decision to build a life that honored my needs and desires rather than theirs. I enrolled in a local community class, began volunteering at a neighborhood center, and found joy in small, steady routines that had nothing to do with the family that had tried to erase me. The pillow with "loser" marked across it remained on a hook by my door, no longer a symbol of anger, but of the moment I said enough. That moment was mine, private and powerful, a turning point that reshaped not just my days, but my very sense of self. Each morning, I wake with a sense of calm that I had not known in years, a quiet peace that comes from living authentically and unapologetically. The legal battles have quieted, the phone rarely rings, and the letters have slowed. I no longer wait for a call that may never come. Instead, I live fully in the life I have chosen, surrounded by people who see me, not as a problem to solve, but as a person to cherish. This climax is not the end of pain or struggle, but the beginning of freedom, the freedom to define myself, to love myself, and to walk forward with dignity. It is the triumph of resilience over neglect, of voice over silence, of self over imposed identity. And it is the quiet, powerful declaration that I am enough, exactly as I am. In the quiet that settled after the storm, I found myself sitting by the window of my small apartment, watching the light shift slowly from day to dusk, the world outside moving on in its steady, unhurried way. The seasons changed, and with them came a gentle sense of peace I hadn't thought possible after all the upheaval. The letter I had sent, the boundaries I had drawn, the choices I had made, they were no longer just acts of defiance, but steps toward something deeper. A life reclaimed, a self rediscovered. I thought often about the women I had met along the way, the ones who carried their own stories of loss and resilience, who taught me that dignity is not given, but taken, and that strength often grows in the soft spaces between despair and hope. Volunteering at the local school brought unexpected joy. The children, with their eager faces and boundless curiosity, reminded me of the reasons I had once embraced grandmotherhood: the desire to nurture, to be part of something greater than myself. I listened to their stories, helped with reading, and in their eyes, I found a reflection of my own worth that no family argument or legal battle could erase. The pillow marked "loser" hung on a hook near my door, no longer a symbol of pain, but a reminder of the moment I chose myself over invisibility. Sometimes I touch the fabric, tracing the letters with my fingers, feeling the weight of that choice and the freedom it brought. The visits from my grandson Michael became more frequent, though on his terms and mine, quiet and without expectation. He was growing into a man shaped by his own struggles and kindnesses, and our conversations were honest and soft, filled with the tentative rebuilding of trust and love. I did not seek to rush or demand. I simply allowed space for connection to grow where it could. The world outside continued to turn, and I found comfort in routine. The warmth of a good cup of tea, the rhythm of pages turning in a book, the simple pleasure of a walk through the neighborhood. I learned to savor these moments, recognizing that happiness is not a grand event, but a collection of small, steady breaths taken in quiet courage. Sometimes I thought of Jordan and Lisa, of the family I had left behind. There was no bitterness, only a deep understanding that some chapters close so that new ones can begin. I wished them well from afar, knowing that healing, like life, is a journey that cannot be hurried or forced. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with soft hues of pink and gold, I wrote a letter, not to them, but to myself. I folded it carefully and tucked it inside my dresser drawer, a secret affirmation of the woman I had become. "Dear me," it began, "you waited so long for someone to save you, but you forgot you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go. And you finally let go back." The words felt like a benediction, a quiet celebration of survival and renewal. I knew the road ahead would still hold challenges, moments of doubt and loneliness, but I also knew that I had the strength to face them. I was no longer the woman who waited in the shadows, unseen and unheard. I was a woman who had stepped into the light, carrying her story with grace and courage. And if this story finds you at the right moment, know this: it is never too late to choose yourself, to set boundaries, to reclaim your voice. Your worth is not defined by others' acceptance, but by your own steadfast love and determination. Walk your path with confidence, even when the way is uncertain. And when you do, come back and tell me. I will be here, listening, believing, and ready to welcome you home. It has been more than a year since I last saw Jordan's house, that place where so many of my hopes quietly withered, and where I learned the hard way that love without respect is a hollow thing. I no longer wake up in the middle of the night expecting to hear their voices in the hallway or the clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Instead, I hear the soft hum of my own refrigerator, the creak of my own floorboards, the gentle wind tapping against the window. My life has grown quieter, but the silence is no longer oppressive. It is the kind of quiet that allows a person to hear her own thoughts without fear of someone else mocking them. People sometimes ask if I miss them, if the space between us has softened with time, but the truth is that missing them is not the same as wanting to go back. I miss the idea of family more than the reality of what ours had become, and I have learned that longing for what could have been is a trap that keeps you bound to the very pain you've tried to escape. In these months, I have built something new for myself, piece by piece, like a quilt stitched from scraps that don't match but somehow form a pattern when you step back far enough. There is the little community garden where I've claimed a corner patch, where the smell of fresh soil and the sight of seedlings pushing through remind me that even late in life, something new can grow. There is the writing circle I joined at the library, where we sit in a circle on Wednesday mornings and read aloud our stories. Not just the polished ones, but the messy ones that sound more like confessions than literature. I never thought I would read about my own life to strangers, but there is a freedom in telling your story without fear of how it will be received, a kind of cleansing that leaves you lighter afterward. Sometimes Michael visits, usually on Saturdays, carrying a grocery bag filled with things he thinks I might like. Fresh bread, a jar of honey, a paperback mystery novel. We don't talk much about the past, but I can see in his eyes that he is still trying to reconcile the grandmother he remembers with the woman who finally walked away. I don't rush him. Trust, once broken, is not rebuilt in a single afternoon. It grows like those seedlings in my garden, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, until one day you look and realize something sturdy has taken root. The pillow with "loser" still hangs by my door, and sometimes visitors ask about it with a puzzled look. I tell them the truth, because I have no interest in protecting the people who once erased me from their lives. It's not about bitterness. It's about owning my story so no one else can twist it. When I see those black letters against the faded fabric, I don't feel the sting I once did. I feel a strange kind of pride, because that moment was when I stopped asking for permission to be treated with dignity. This year, I traveled for the first time in decades, not far. Just a short train ride to a coastal town where the air smelled of salt and old wooden piers creaked under the weight of time. I walked along the shoreline, collecting small, smooth stones that fit perfectly into the curve of my palm, and I thought about all the women I've met who have been told, in ways big and small, to make themselves smaller, quieter, less demanding. I thought about how many of us carry invisible bruises from words spoken in jest, from jokes that were never funny, from the slow dismissal that comes when people decide you are no longer central to their lives. I imagined handing each of those women a stone from my pocket, as if to say, "Here, hold this. Feel the weight of it. And remember, you are still here." Life is not without its lonely days. There are mornings when the tea tastes flat and the air feels heavy, when I wonder if I have simply traded one kind of solitude for another. But then there are moments when I laugh out loud at something in a book, or when I see a child's face light up in the school garden as they pull up a carrot they planted weeks before, and I realize that joy is not gone. It is simply quieter now, more deliberate, and perhaps more precious because of it. I have learned to measure my life differently. Once I counted it in family gatherings, in birthdays and holidays, in how many people sat around the table. Now, I measure it in the satisfaction of finishing a chapter, in the number of blossoms on the tomato plant, in the quiet satisfaction of a clean kitchen at the end of the day. I do not live for anyone else's timetable anymore. Sometimes I still dream about Jordan and Lisa, but in the dreams, we are strangers passing on a street, our eyes meeting briefly before we move on. There is no anger there, just an acknowledgement that we once knew each other and that knowing was not enough to keep us together. If they were to call tomorrow, I would answer, but I would not go back. I have no desire to re-enter a place where my worth was negotiable. As I write this, the sun is beginning to set, and the light slants across my living room in a way that makes everything look softer, as if the edges of the day are blurring into night. I think about the girl I once was, the young woman, the mother, the grandmother, and I realize that through all those roles, I never really asked who I was beneath them. Now I know. I am a woman who walked away when it was hardest, who stood in her own truth when it was easier to disappear, who learned that love is not worth having if it costs you yourself. If another woman were to come to me now, sitting across this same table with the same tightness in her chest that I once felt, I would tell her this: you are allowed to leave. You are allowed to choose yourself, and when you do, the silence that follows will not be empty. It will be the sound of your own life returning to you. It has been long enough now that the sharp edges of those months have worn down into smoother shapes, but they have not disappeared. I think this is what healing actually looks like. Not the erasure of pain, but the ability to hold it in your hands without it cutting you open every time. The past is like an old photograph I keep in a drawer. I rarely take it out, but when I do, I look at it with a mixture of tenderness and caution, as if I am remembering both the good and the truth at the same time. There were moments, even in the worst of it, when the light was still there, Michael laughing as a child, the smell of cinnamon rolls in the oven, the small comfort of a quilt on my lap. I do not throw those away just because the ending was cruel. I let them exist alongside the rest because all of it made me who I am now. My apartment has become more than just a refuge. It is a map of the life I have rebuilt. The walls are lined with shelves that hold not just books, but small treasures gathered over these months. A jar of sea glass from that trip to the coast, a clay mug made by one of the school children as a thank you, a pressed flower I found on the sidewalk on the first spring morning after my move. These objects may seem small, but they are proof that I have been present for my own life, that I have paid attention, that I have collected beauty where I once collected obligations. There are days when I wake early, make a cup of tea, and sit on the balcony just to watch the street below as it slowly comes alive. The paperboy tossing the morning news, the shop owner pulling up the shutters, the sound of footsteps on their way to work. All these tiny rhythms feel like belonging, even if no one on that street knows my name. I have come to believe that belonging is not always about being claimed by people. Sometimes it is about claiming your own place in the world and letting it root you quietly. Michael still visits now and then, and each time he stays a little longer. Last week, he brought an old photo album he had found in his father's attic. We sat together, turning the pages slowly, my fingers brushing over the faces frozen in time. There was my younger self, smiling with the kind of open trust that seems almost foreign to me now. There was Jordan as a boy, with a mischievous grin and scraped knees. There were birthdays, picnics, summers by the lake. We didn't speak much. The silence between us was gentle, the kind that says, "We are here, and that is enough for now." When he left, I noticed he had taken a small stone from my bowl by the door, the smooth ones I collect from my walks. He didn't say why, but I understood. Some things are carried without explanation. The garden at the community center has become my sanctuary. There is something humbling about planting seeds you may not live to see bloom fully. I tend to the soil with patience, watering and weeding. watching the slow magic of growth. It reminds me that change is never instant, that the roots of resilience are invisible at first. The children who come to help me plant often tell me their own little troubles, a fight with a friend, a bad grade, a pet that ran away, and I listen with the seriousness those troubles deserve. No one ever grows too old for their pain to be heard. From time to time, I still encounter people who knew me before. They look at me with a certain expression, a mix of curiosity and pity, as if they are trying to measure whether I am better or worse off now. I smile politely and let them think what they will. I no longer measure my life by their yardstick. If they see me as diminished because I live alone, that is their lens, not mine. If they see me as braver for walking away, that too belongs to them. I am not here to manage their opinions. The pillow with loser remains on its hook, though it has begun to fade from sunlight. Sometimes I think about taking it down, about letting that chapter rest entirely. But then I remember that it isn't just a reminder of the cruelty. It's a reminder of my refusal to accept it. It is my proof that I didn't just endure. I acted. Even if the action was small, it was mine, and it changed everything. Recently, I began writing letters to my younger self. I tell her all the things I wish someone had told me. That you do not have to earn love by shrinking yourself. That silence is not the same as peace. That your worth is not tied to your usefulness. I write these letters on good paper with a fountain pen, as if the act of making them beautiful is part of the healing. I keep them in a box on my desk, and sometimes I imagine a girl decades from now finding them and reading them as if they were written for her. Life is not perfect. Some evenings, the loneliness sits with me like an uninvited guest, and I wonder what it would have been like if things had turned out differently. But I do not stay in that wondering for long. I have learned that peace is not about never feeling the ache. It is about knowing you can live with it and still choose joy. If you had told me 2 years ago that I would be living like this, alone but unafraid, surrounded by small tokens of my own making, part of a community that sees me, I would have thought you were telling me a fairy tale. But here I am. And though my story does not end with a grand reunion or a dramatic apology, it ends with something better. A quiet, steady truth. I am here. I am whole. And I belong entirely to myself.